Hi, I'm Jen Wagner, a quilt pattern designer and quilting instructor. If you're new to quilting, this video is perfect for you. In some previous YouTube tutorials, I've covered some basics, how to use a rotary cutter and how to use a sewing machine, what all those buttons are, how to thread it, and how to make it work. Today, we are focusing on one of the most essential skills in quilting, the 1/4 inch seam, what it is, why it matters, and how to get it just right. I'll be demonstrating this technique using a block from my brand new quilt pattern, Squarely Modern. This pattern is a fantastic project for your first quilt. It's also a great option if you're looking for a fun, fast project that comes together quickly and easily with some chain piecing. For this quilt, I used a fabric collection called Dazzle Dots 2 by Christa Watson for Benertex. I picked this fabric not only because Christa is an amazing quilter and my friend, but also because the dots in this design are both squares and circles, making it a perfect match for this quilt. I love circles, but since curved piecing isn't really the easiest place to start when making a quilt, this pattern sneaks in a fun circle illusion without any tricky stitching or applique. To highlight the effect, I arranged the colors from Dazzle Dots 2 within one of these illusion circles to really make them pop. So what the heck is a seam? A seam is simply the stitching that holds the fabric layers together, and the seam allowance is the space between that stitching and the fabric edge. Getting this just right is critical in quilting. If your seam is too wide or too narrow, your pieces won't fit together. For example, in this Squarely Modern quilt, this block has 2 sections, and this unit needs to fit with this rectangle. If my seam allowance was off in these seams, it could end up too large or too small to fit. Now, many quilters prefer to use a scant 1/4 inch seam, which means it's just slightly smaller than that full 1/4 inch. And they use this because when we go to press this seam, that thickness of the fabric is in the fold, making the seam slightly larger. So if we start by stitching it smaller, then it ends up being exactly a 1/4 inch seam. Now, before diving into a quilt project, it's a great idea to make a test block. And the reason is that a test block helps you understand how the block is put together, helps you work through any challenges ahead of time, and it helps you check your seam allowance for accuracy so that you can see that the entire block is going to fit together. Now, the thickness of the fabric will affect the seam allowance, so when making your test block, it's best to use a similar fabric. So, for example, my quilt isn't made of batiks, and batiks are thinner, so if I did my test block out of batiks, my seam allowance wouldn't be the same. Now, there are lots of ways to achieve a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, and today I'm going to walk you through my 2 favorite methods. So grab your sewing machine, some fabric scraps, and an iron, and let's get going. For the first method, I'm going to use a standard presser foot. And you can see that this foot is pretty wide, meaning that it covers all of these feed dogs under here. This is what's going to pull the fabric through, and the foot completely covers them, providing consistent pressure between the foot and the feed dogs on my fabric. The other thing about this foot is it has a nice wide opening for the needle to move through. So I'm going to take 2 pieces of my scrap fabric, and you can see I've put them with the print sides together. This is known as right sides together, and I've matched up one of these raw edges. Now I'm going to make this match up right here with the edge of my foot. And as I'm sewing, I'm not watching the needle because the needle's already going in the fabric. It's too late. What I'm watching is right here on this edge where this fabric is going underneath the foot, and I'm going to guide it to keep it there. Now I'm going to take a few stitches and sew with this right down the middle. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my needle over 1 position. So I'm going to sew a few stitches with it moved over 1. Again, I'm watching, making sure my fabric is matching the edge of my foot. And now I'm going to move it over again. So it's 2 notches over now. And I'm going to sew a little bit. Now I'm going to move it over 3. And I'm going to sew a little bit more. Now I'm going to move it over 4. And I'm going to sew a little bit more. and I'm going to move it over 5, and I'm going to sew the rest. Now 5 is as far as my machine will let me go, and so I'm going to take this off, and what I'm looking for is where did my sewing machine sew a perfect 1/4 inch seam? So let's get a ruler out and measure. Now I'm going to make this easy to remember by marking that this was where I used my needle in the center. This is when I moved it 1, this is where I moved it 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm just using a Sharpie on there so I can remember. And now I'm going to put this on my ruler, and you can see 3 is hitting about right on, but 4 is hitting slightly inside. So if I wanted a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, I would use 3, and if I was aiming for a scant, I would use 4. 5 moves in too far. So this is a great way, and you can keep this for your reference. You could just pin it near your sewing machine or on your wall by your sewing machine in your sewing room, so that you remember your needle positions and how they affect your seam allowance. Okay, let's go on to method 2. Now for method 2, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch foot. This foot is different than my standard foot because it's narrower, and so the distance from the center to the edge is exactly a 1/4 inch seam. With this foot, you always want to be using it with the needle centered right here in the middle of the foot. There isn't a hole big enough for you to do a wide stitch, and so you can't do a zigzag or a decorative stitch with this foot like you can a standard foot. The other great thing about this foot is there are little notches here on the sides of the foot. Let me show you where they are, right here. And these little notches are all a 1/4 inch apart. So if I had to turn and go sew down 2 sides of a corner, it would let me know where to stop and drop my needle and turn to get that exact 1/4 inch seam on both sides. So that comes in handy too. So when I sew with my 1/4 inch foot, I am going to do exactly like I did before. I'm going to take my pieces of some practice fabric and I'm going to put them right sides together with the raw edges meeting. And just like we had done before, I am going to line up my fabric with the edge of this foot. And I find that different machines, you sew with them slightly differently to get that perfect 1/4 inch seam. So it's a good idea to practice this on whatever sewing machine you're going to be using for your project. And you can see here on my throat plate, there is a tiny little 1/4 inch mark. And so I am watching ahead, making sure that I can see that mark the entire time. My fabric is on the left side of that mark, and that's going to give me that scant 1/4 inch seam with this machine and with this foot. So let's sew a little bit. And I'm intentionally using contrasting thread so that you can really see where my 1/4 inch seam is. Okay, perfect. Now let's go over and measure this and see how our 1/4 inch seam with this foot compares with the other foot. Now, when you are done stitching your second sample, it's a good idea to come back here to your ruler and just line this up and see how well that method is working for you. And you can see for the most part, my stitching is falling, making a scant 1/4 inch seam. Sometimes it's not, but I'm not going to beat myself up over that. I had a camera in front of me. And so continuing to work on getting that seam as accurate as possible is going to create better results in your quilting projects. Now, we also need to talk about pressing because we've worked so hard to stitch this to get an accurate 1/4 inch seam, but if we go to press this and we have extra fabric folded over in the seam, guess what? We've made our seam allowance even smaller. And so it's really important that we completely open up a seam and iron it to continue making it accurate. And most patterns will tell you to press to the side, meaning that this extra fabric here falls over to one side. It can go either direction. Some patterns will have you press it open. Regardless of however you iron this, you really want to make sure the most important thing is that there's no extra fabric in the fold. And so I'm going to take my iron here and iron this down. You can just tug on it and see that There is no extra fabric here folding over, and this is accurate. Mastering the 1/4 inch seam takes a little practice, but once you get it down, your quilt blocks will fit beautifully together. Thank you so much for joining me in my studio today. Let me know in the comments below which method you prefer. And don't forget to check out my new Squarely Modern quilt pattern. It's a fantastic beginner-friendly project. And like and subscribe and tell your friends. Happy quilting!